Well, hello. Welcome back to the Lagoon. Or rather, welcome back to the Grand Library. Today we're going to be reading another one of H.P. Lovecraft's works called The Outsider. Now, I just want to go ahead and dedicate this entire video to anyone who has been bullied. So I'm sure that's going to be almost every single person that's going to watch this video. And I'm sorry that you were bullied. I myself was bullied in school. And when I first discovered Lovecraft, I discovered him through a video game called that was made by Bethesda Studios called Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. This game came out on Xbox as well as PC. If you've never played a game and you like to play games, I highly recommend it, although it is a Bethesda game, so it's full of bugs in more ways than one. My point is, after playing that game and having my mind blown with all the fish monsters and all that stuff, because that game is based upon the previous story, Dagon and the Shadow over Innsmouth, as well as the Call of Cthulhu. And it drew me into this dark, mystical, esoteric, occult, horror, cosmic horror universe. And I immediately became obsessed, and I immediately went to the nearest bookstore I could and went to the horror section to find any tome of Lovecraft possible. And I did, and hopefully I can find that book someday here in the Grand Library. There are many books here within these hollowed halls. So I will try to find it and read that from you. The art is really awesome and epic. It has art done by Mike Mignola, the creator and artist and writer of Hellboy, which also are fun comics to read that are also here within the Grand Library if you ever want to come here and read them. Now, to bring it back to focus of what this video is, I read that book that I obtained at the bookstore, and the first short story in it was The Outsider. Now, I very much wish I could pull out to you right now The Outsider and Others, the very first printing ever of Lovecraft's works, but unfortunately Gill-boy does not have that yet, but one day hopes to obtain it and have it solidified within the Grand Library. However, this short story was reprinted in the Arkham House binding of the Dunwich Horror and Others. You got your boy Wilbert Wheatley right there. And yes, one day I do plan to read the Dunwich Horror, but in due time. That's more of a tale closer to Halloween and is, in my opinion, the OG Texas Chainsaw Massacre, although it doesn't necessarily take place in the South, but it deals kind of rednecks from Massachusetts. So, and yes, there are rednecks in Massachusetts. There's rednecks everywhere. They're not confined solely to the South. So, point being, The Outsider, when I first read that, I read it when I was in high school going through some rough times, some rough bullying, and man, it brought a lot of healing out for me. And as soon as I read this story, I immediately fell in love with Lovecraft, and he became my favorite author ever since, because, you know, sometimes when you get bullied, you know, it does make you feel like an outsider. It makes you feel like you're this Frankenstein's monster, you know, you're Dracula, you're the Gill man, you're this monster outside of society and the people that like you. And so I love this tale, and I hope you will too, and I hope it brings you comfort, and you know, just embrace that inner monster within, you know. But before we begin to read it, I just want to say, you know, give a little history on it here. It was written between March and August of 1921. It was the first published in Weird Tales in April 1926. In this work, a mysterious individual who has been living alone in a castle for as long as he can remember decides to break free in a search of human contact and light. You know, we're all just trying to find friends, and then sometimes when we try to find them, you know, they're kind of mean. But anyways, The Outsider is one of Lovecraft's most commonly reprinted works, and is also one of the most popular stories ever to be published in Weird Tales. So, you know, this is honestly, I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, 10 out of 10 for your boy Gill-boy here. You know, you gotta dress the part, you know, and I apologize for the lack of tie. Like, it's so glaring to me, and I'm sure to you. But as I said, you know, sometimes the deep ones, you gotta give them something in order to still live out here. So, you know, tie it was. Full disclosure on that. But anyways, this is a classic Lovecraft story, and it combines horror, fantasy, and gothic fiction to create this really nightmarish tale. Okay, and it themes are loneliness and feeling abhuman, and you know, a lot of side effects from bullying makes you feel like that. It dehumanizes you, and so I think that's why a lot of people who have experienced deep trauma, when they read this story, it really resonates with them. So enough on all that, because we could talk a lot about this story, but we're already, you know, getting close to the 6-minute and 10-second mark. So it's time to read it, because I want to also explore other stories within this dream cycle. So this will be the first dream cycle story that is uploaded to the channel. Lovecraft has 2 phases. Dream cycle, which are more kind of horror fantasy mixed with gothic fiction, and then these straight stories that take place in the waking world, otherwise known as Yog-Sothory, Cthulhu mythos. You know, like the stories like Dagon and the Temple, and the Dunwich Horror, Call of Cthulhu, Shadow over Innsmouth, Shadow Out of Time, Haunter in the Dark, stuff like that. And then you have the stuff that kind of is still within that universe, but is more in the dream world. And so that's what we're going to read. And the next 2 videos are also going to be that as well. And I'll discuss that after we read The Outsider. So, excuse me, I beg your pardon. Without further ado, The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. That night in the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon, and large coffin worm, were long be nightmared. Keats. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lone hours in vast and dismal chambers with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon awed watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me, the dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet I am strangely content and cling desperately to those sear memories. When my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other, I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings where the eyes could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridors seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as if the piled up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used some time to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I cannot recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since from my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decaying like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that strewed some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in many of the moldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years. Not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in the books. I felt conscious of youth because I remembered so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark newt trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but I went farther from the castle. The shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear. So I ran frantically back, lest I lose my way in a labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then in the shadowy solitude my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower, and reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky. And at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky in Paris than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight I climbed the worn and aged stone stairs till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung perilously to small footholds leading upward. Ghastly and terrible was that dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister, with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill as a haunted and venerable mold assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure, that I might peer out and above, and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing hand found the barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing the slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher I knew that my climb was for the nonce ended. Since the slab was the trapdoor of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower, no doubt the floor of some lofty and capacious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully, and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt, and as I lay exhausted on the stone floor I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, but hoped when necessary to pry it up again. Believing I was now at prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows, that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I had read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble, bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected, and wondered what horrid secrets might abide in this high apartment, so many aeons cut off from the castle below. Then, unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway, where hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward. As I did so, there came to me the purest ecstasy I have ever known, for shining tranquilly through an ornate grafting of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascend from the newly found doorway was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and in vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height of which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare in terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this: instead of a dizzying prospect of tree tops seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me on the level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified by marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church, whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path and stretched away into two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even the fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch, out of that region of slabs and columns, and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, but sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across the swift river where crumbling mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable ivied castle in a thickly wooded park, maddening familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings existed to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows gorgeously ablaze with light, and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company, indeed, making merry and speaking brightly to one another. I had never seemingly heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought up incredibly remote recollections. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brightly lightened room, stepping as I did so from my single bright moment of hope to my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the seal when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face, evoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly, awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. Cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved toward one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the gold-arched doorway, leading to another and somewhat similar room.
As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly. And then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which by its simple appearance changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and dissolution, the putrid, dripping evion of wholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows it was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet, to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealing outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape. And in its moldy, disintegrating apparel, an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not much so to make a feeble effort toward flight, a backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes, bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared lonesomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred and showed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself yet able to throw out a hand to ward off the fetid apparition which pressed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accidents, my fingers touched the rotting outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arc. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew in that second all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle in the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized, most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos there is balm as well as bitterness. And that balm is nepenthe. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble and went down the steps, I found the stone-trap door immovable, but I was not sorry, for I had hated the antique castle in the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Neferka, in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadaf by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save the unnamed feast of Nitocris beneath the great pyramid. Yet in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcome the bitterness of alienage. For although Nepenthe has claimed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century and among those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within the great gilded flame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass.
Oh yeah, bro, fuck your bullies, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that word. My fault. But yeah, great story. Awesome. Gothic horror. Super creepy. Hope I did it justice. try to do a creepy voice that turned into a scarier voice as it went. Hopefully it went well. I hope you enjoyed it. So there's a lot we could talk about on this story. So let's do that for a little bit. So this, excuse me, this was inspired because basically in a letter, Lovecraft himself said that of all of his tales, this story most closely resemble the style of his idol Edgar Allan Poe, which it does. I'm sure if you've read Poe, you'll be like, wow, that's very kind of Poe-ish with all the gothic horror scenery and the festivities and these buildings and stuff like that, and the gothic, you know, Catholic cathedrals in the background and stuff like that. But Lovecraft here, I just want to say, because he wrote a lot of letters, and maybe I'll read some of those someday too, because I have one of those books from Arkham House too. Perhaps I'll show you in another video. But he said that it represents my literal, though unconscious, imitation of Poe at its very height, which, yeah, you can see that this is heavily inspired by Poe. In the opening paragraphs echo those of Poe's Bernice, while the horror at the party recalls the unmasking scene in The Mask of the Red Death. Like I was saying, yeah, that's a great film, great Vincent Price film as well. But yeah, if you want to criticize this, and I know some critics have said, you know, it's autobiographical, and that Lovecraft was talking about his own life, you know, in the story. And like I've said previously in other videos, you know, his mother was very mentally ill, and she had to be institutionalized in a insane asylum, and she really fed Lovecraft with a lot of hatred, and also locked him in a closet because she said that he was a hideous child, and she wanted him to be a little girl, so she would dress him as a little girl, and you know, referred to him as the wrong gender and stuff like that. So you can see how Lovecraft totally feels alienated. You know, he was dehumanized as a young child, and very emotionally and verbally. And I don't know if there's ever signs of physical abuse, but he was definitely heavily mentally and emotionally and psychologically abused as a infant. So this, very much so, would make him feel like an outsider. And so this is why I've always liked him as an author, because he manages to capture in this story to me the underground of the underdog of the underdog, the outsider of the outsiders. And so I really love this story. I think it's a classic, 10 out of 10. There was another Stuart Gordon film that was based off of this story. As far as it being an adaptation of it, not really. There's only kind of a scene where the family hears a glass, like a mirror glass break. And, you know, if you've read the story, you're like, oh, that's the creature that was locked in the castle that got out and saw himself. It's just like the story. So I wouldn't say it's like a very accurate adaptation of the story. But if you look at it as being inspired by this story and it's standalone, phenomenal film. It's very disturbing. Like, I saw it when I was too young and it traumatized me. And I still kind of try to pull it out every October, every once in a while. But it's called Castle Freak, and it's made by Full Moon Pictures, and I believe Stuart Gordon was the director. And of course, the great Jeffrey Combs is in it, and he plays the father who inherits this ancient castle because his, you know, whatever just recently died. And of course, it was the woman that was taking care of the castle freak, the outsider. You know, it's mentioned in the story, somebody took care of me, kind of thing. So I mean, it does feel like the character from the book, but it's a different story. It's not like this gothic scenery. It's like this family that's living in the castle that he then disturbs and starts killing. And they do this wonderful, creepy thing because his daughter is blind. And so, like, the creature comes in, it's very Dr. Cabinet of Caligari, and he comes in and starts touching her. It's so disturbing. It's a great scene. I highly recommend that film. If you like this story and you know, want to get kind of disturbed tonight, and, you know, I would recommend watching Castle Freak. It's a great film. I will definitely do a full in-depth review of that film in the future, and hopefully we can show it at Spooky Fam, because it's a great film. It's a classic in its own B-horror movie right. But other than that, I guess there's not too much to say. So some of the places that were mentioned in the story will return in other dream cycle stories. Like other characters will go to those places that this outsider, this creature, this ghoul went. He's not a ghoul, but because there are ghouls in the dream cycle, you'll see, especially when we read Pickman's model. But the next video I would like to do is to do the Doom that came to Sarnath, and then, or Sarnath, excuse me, and then the White Ship, and then I'll have the Statement of Randolph Carter for you again, and then the Unnamables there for you, and then I'm going to do another video that'll be new, and then after that I will then upload once per week more videos. So I hope you're enjoying your time at the Grand Library at the Lagoon, and I hope this story really resonated with you and you can embrace your inner creepy monster. It's good to be an outsider. Why would you want to be a part of those preppy posers? You know what I'm saying? All right, rock on, stay salty and stay spooky. Woo!